Good morning. It's good to see everybody here this morning. Real quick, something that actually just happened. Everything's okay, but Hillary texted me that she got into a little bit of a fender bender going to Kannapolis this morning, backing up out of the driveway. First thing I asked was, "Are the girls all right?" She said yes. And she showed me some pictures. She said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, worst case scenario, we just have to replace it. But if she thinks she's getting off the hook without me telling jokes, she's got something else coming." So, but everybody's okay. But she's really a little shaken up about it just because of all that goes on with women. No, just kidding. Which is a great segue into what we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to look, as we continue our series about redeeming the family. That's the focus of our year, is focusing on the family. And what better place to start talking about the family than in the book of Genesis? I mean, we see in the book of Genesis literally means the beginning. It is the beginning of mankind. It is the first time that we are introduced to this relationship or multitude of relationships between man and woman, between humanity and God. And this is the nexus of our relationship with each other as individuals, our relationship with God as individuals, but also there's a lot to be said in the book of Genesis with regards to family dynamics. The book of Genesis is ripe with a bunch of families. Some good examples of what takes place in the family and some bad examples of what takes place in the family. So for the next couple of weeks anyways, we're going to be looking at some of these families, and we're going to draw some conclusions about what's good for the family and also what is bad for the family. Now, this also is very applicable if you are single too. And so today we're going to talk about something that everybody here will encounter with family, with individuals, with people, and even maybe with God. And that's this word that most of the time, some people, they enjoy it, right? Some people try to skate around it, and some people simply ignore it, even when they know that it's bound to happen. And that's this word, conflict. There are some people who thrive off of it. There are just people in the world, and some of you guys know, have people right now in your mind about people who thrive off conflict. Some people, once again, try to skate around it. They try and avoid it like the plague, right? And then there are others who simply ignore it. And so in Genesis chapter 1, there are a couple of common things that are related to conflict. There's some commonalities that result in conflict. And so, but first, even before we note those, go to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1. And note something that takes place in the first, let's go 10 verses. It says in Genesis chapter 1, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the water. Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. God saw the light, and it was good. And God separated the light from the darkness and called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening and there was morning one day. Then God said, 'Let there be an expanse between the waters, separating the waters from water.' So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse sky. Evening came and then morning the second day. Then God said, 'Let water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let the dry lands appear.' And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of water he called seas. And God saw it, and it was good. Notice the consistent theme just in those first 10 verses. The consistent theme and the consistent phrase that is seen in those first 10 verses is God. And God said something, and that took place. So before we even talk about some of the things that we're going to see later down the line, the basis for the family unit, the basis for harmony, the basis for peace, the basis to dealing with conflict, whether you are an individual or whether you are part of a immediate or extended family, which all of us are those words. God said. And so before we even look at what takes place with Adam and Eve, so often we enter into these discussions or these, quote, passionate disagreements with our husbands, with our wife, and we're so focused and so on to what we want to get off of our chest or what we want to say or what we're going to do or why the situation is going to go our way, and we don't stop and we don't pause and we don't say, what does God say? If you want conflict to run your life, if you want disunity to run your family, ignore the very first phrase that's talked about in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God. And notice what takes place in Genesis chapter 1. Throughout the course of the creation, God says and it happens. And at the end of each of those sections, God looks upon the creation and he says, it's so, or it's good. And at the completion of his creation in which he creates man, he looks at the totality of what is created and says, it is very good. No conflict, no strife, but peace and harmony between God's creation and even peace and harmony within the creation. And notice what takes place also in the beginning. That there are these things that are formless and void, that are empty without form. And God says and he moves and he makes that which is empty whole. He makes that which is formless take shape. And that is the motive of God being in your life and God being in my life as well from a spiritual standpoint. He wants to take those who are formless and void and give them form after the shape of Jesus Christ so that they might also be filled with life in Jesus Christ. This is from the beginning all the way to the end, the purpose of why God does what he does throughout the pages of Scripture. And then in Genesis chapter 2, we see that the author of Genesis hones in on the day in which mankind was created. And he notes that man, Adam, did not have a suitable partner. And from Adam made woman. And that also was very good. That now the creation in its totality was not only complete, but God had finished his creation and noted that there was peace and that there was harmony, that there was no conflict. And isn't all that kind of how marriage starts out? And we date for a little bit, we court for a little bit, and then there's a special day in which everybody gets together from all sides of the family. Everybody dresses up. The groom dresses in what the wife tells him to dress in. It's true. There's no way you would have ever gotten me into red skinny jeans for my wedding on my own. It's just the truth. Because I love her, okay? And then the wife-to-be dresses in what she's going to dress in, and then there's this ceremony. And at that moment, in that place, and for the few minutes or days after, They call it the honeymoon period. Everything, at least in the minds of the husband, at least in the minds of the wife, and everybody else who's a part of this ceremony, everything is harmonious. But as we look into the culture and as we even look into the statistics about society in and of itself, and even as we look into statistics about marriage, not just within the culture, but also within the church, there doesn't seem to be a lot of harmony. It doesn't seem to be a lot of peace. It seems that this thing called marriage, this thing called family, is ripe with conflict. And that it doesn't reflect the very good nature of what is seen in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And we sit, and some of us cry, and some of us talk, and some of us wonder, how in the world did something that started out as a fairy tale, and they shall live happily ever after, become so destructive, become so painful, hurt so bad? And so we go off to our counselors, we read our self-help books, we do all the things that we can try and do. And for whatever reason, for some of us, not all of us, for some of us, we can't shake the conflict in our family. Because we don't know the cause of conflict. We think externally, it's this person, it's this event. It's because someone said something over here or someone did something over there, but I would say that is a symptom of a much greater problem. Notice what takes place, and you have heard this story, you have read this story, you have looked at this story has been with you. If you've been in the church, this story has been with you since the time you can remember. But before we get to that, I wanted to note something in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 that I found just yesterday. That Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, depending on which translation you have, consists of 56 verses. And of those 56 verses, the word God is mentioned 42 times. Because if we're going to handle conflict, and if we're going to handle and get past some of the things that take place in our lives, some of the things that take place in our family, what God is saying in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is that He is the anchor, the pillar, and support, and the solution to all of that. So, Genesis chapter 3, we don't know how much time has passed between the creation of Adam and Eve and this very situation that we find in Genesis chapter 3. But it notes in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1, now the serpent was the most cunning of all the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? Number one of the reasons, here's a common thing that comes with conflict, is that there are other voices that impact the totality of the picture. And whether you know it or not, whether you believe it or not, whether you want to accept it or not, every day that you wake up and every day that I wake up, there are going to be people in your life, in my life, who want to insert themselves into our lives and dominate the direction not only of our life, but of our family. Now I say this tongue in cheek because I love them. In-laws, ever dealt with them? Some of you can understand that. Now I say that as a joke, but sometimes the people who say they love us the most are the ones who want to dictate our marriages the most and want to give us the least amount of control in our lives. Here's something that I'd like to say to all the in-laws in the house. There's something to be said when God says that a man leaves and cleaves to his wife. That the primary people who are involved in resolving conflict in a marriage is not mom and dad. It is husband and wife. And if they seek your counsel, that's fine. But there's no reason for people on the outside of a husband and wife marriage to, in an ungodly way, to insert themselves into a marriage as to control one piece of the puzzle. And here Satan, in a very cunning way, is inserting himself into this relationship between not only Adam and Eve, but Adam and Eve and their relationship with God. And we live in a culture in which so many voices scream and so many voices yell because they want you and they want me to abandon the central pillar of what it means to have peace in life, God, because they believe that something else is better just because of some of the things we're going to see later down the line. So, husbands, wives, when you have conflict in your marriage, the only person that you need to be listening to, or the only two people that you need to be listening to initially, is God and your spouse. And if it's an agreement upon both of you to seek outside help, then do so. But notice throughout this entire section, as Satan talks to Eve, and as Satan talks to Adam and Eve, there's not one point in this section that Adam and Eve ask this very question. Hey God, what do you think about this? Have you ever noticed that? Not one point in all of chapter 3 do they consider what God wants. Number 2, one of the ways in which you'll experience conflict in your marriage is when you fail to ask the question, what does God want in this scenario? What does God want, or what does God say in light of maybe the external advice that I've been received or that I've been given? And so Satan does what? He lies straight to Eve. He says, does God really say that you can't have anything from any tree in the garden? Did God say that? Not at all. He said, you've got one tree that you can't eat from. And so Satan seeks to twist the words of God so that he might gain the favor and the acceptance of Eve. And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat the fruit from the trees in the garden, but about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, God said, you must not eat or touch it, or you will die. Notice what the serpent says. No, you will not die. Well, wait, that's a conflicting story here. You've got one person over here that's saying, hey, I will die if I eat that. And you have the serpent over here saying, well, no, you won't die. Question, what did God say? When you hear all the voices in your relationship, when you get all the advice from the YouTubes, and when you get all the advice from the TV, and when you get all the advice from your friends, and you get all the advice from your family, the question still remains, what does God say? And he says, in fact, God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Another question that should be asked. Where in the world is Adam? In this entire dialogue between the serpent and Eve, it is apparent one of two things. Either Adam is not there, or Adam's there and he doesn't particularly care about what's going on. Now, the text doesn't indicate that Adam went off on a long journey in the garden. But soon after this takes place, he partakes in the same thing that Eve takes place, which leads us to the conclusion that Adam was there. You want conflict in your marriage? Don't be a support structure for your spouse. Adam, in his duty as the husband of Eve, knowing the truth, should have stepped in and stopped what was going on. Yet instead, he simply neglected the trouble that was upon his wife. And notice what takes place after that. And these are the three principles that are seen throughout all conflicts for all time. The woman saw that the tree was good for food and delightful to look at, and that it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. So she took some of its fruit and ate it. She gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. So you might be like, Dean, what's going on? How would you, what three principles? And you don't have to turn over there, but I'll come back. In 1 John chapter 2, he says there in verse 15, do not love the world or the things in the world. For if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father. And notice what Satan said to the woman. God knows that once you eat of this, that you will become like him, and you will know good from evil. And so she saw first that what was to be taken was delightful to her eyes. The lust of the eyes. Knew that it would benefit her flesh. Lust of the flesh. And then the boastful pride of life. She believed in what Satan said, that if I take this, I will be a god unto myself. And those are the three principles that don't only impact individuals, they also impact marriages as well. They also impact families. And so maybe one of the things that impacts or harms a marriage is the lust of the eyes, the lust of the wandering eyes. When we look at the statistics behind why so many families and marriages are broken up, the number one reason is because somebody found something in somebody else. Because after all, it's the lust of the eyes. Or maybe it's the lust of the flesh as well. That there's certain substances and things that somebody gets addicted to, and they just can't shake that, and it causes so many problems and so many rifts that it makes the marriage relationship not only difficult, but unwanting. But at the root of both of those is the third principle, is the boastful pride of life. And I don't know if you've seen the new Coca-Cola commercial. Not that I dislike Coca-Cola, okay? But the new slogan behind Coca-Cola is Coca-Cola, because I can. And so essentially that's exactly what Adam and Eve were doing. As they partook of the fruit, they did so because, after all, I can. And after all, why can't I? And after all, isn't it true that I can just kind of do what I want, when I want, or how I want? I mean, I'm not really hurting anybody. And that's a great slogan until somebody gets hurt. And it's clear here that the receiving end of their decision was not just each other, but was God. And then comes the invariable consequence in that once this conflict takes place and once the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the boastful pride of life impacts this marriage, impacts this union, impacts this family, impacts these individual people, what's next? You've seen it in the movies. Some of you have seen it in real life. The cover-up. Literally and figuratively. Upon their act, they covered themselves because of the shame and the guilt that they now knew. But then they tried to hide it from the one person they absolutely, positively couldn't hide it from. They went and they hid in the garden. And they heard the sound of the Lord as he was passing through. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he calls out to Adam and says, "Where are you?" And he says, "I'm here, for I am naked and I was hiding from you." And then God asks a very important question. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree? And in the cover-up, in the cover-up, it expounds on the conflict, right? The conflict has already taken place. The conflict is, how do we reconcile this situation with God? And so what expounds and what makes the conflict worse is in the cover-up, because what does Adam say? It's not my fault. Me? No, it can't be me. It's not me. There's no way it could be me. Because after all, I'm Adam. Because after all, I didn't do what I should have done. I should have been the support and the pillar for my wife and stopped this action. But actually, the reason all this happened, God, her. And so then we enter the blame game. You want conflict in your marriage? You want conflict in your life? Just blame everybody else for all the ridiculous things that you do. Happily ever after, I love her to death. You do? Yeah. How much? Well, I just blame her for everything that I do. Wrong. Everything I do right, that's mine, that's me. You love him? Oh, I would die for him. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, I really want to kill him because he's the root of all the problems. You want a conflict? Just blame everybody for all your stuff. Blame him, blame her. And then what does she do? She has the ability to correct the situation. Okay, Eve, your husband said that it's your fault. What do you say? Well, it's neither of our faults. It's this snake over here. It's Satan. Satan was the one. The devil made me do it. Did he really? See, he offered something that provided a temporary satisfaction that could not fill her heart, their heart, eternally. And so she blamed the serpent. And in all of this, the setting of the garden, the peace between husband and wife, the peace between mankind and God was fractured and broken. So when we blame others for our stuff, when we buy into this idea of, hey, I can be a God unto myself. When we fall for the trap set by the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life, you are guaranteed 100% satisfaction in knowing that conflict is around the corner. And for some of us this morning, maybe in our marriages, maybe in our lives, we've been passing the buck off to our husband, we've been passing the buck off to our spouse, we've been passing the buck off to everybody else except us. I wonder, and I don't know that I have an answer for it, I wonder what would have happened in that space and in that time if Adam and Eve had simply told the truth. I wonder what would have happened if Adam hadn't had a lapse in assessing the value of his wife and stopped her, or stopped Satan from talking to her. And I wonder what would have happened if in that situation, as the conversation between Eve and the serpent takes place, if they had just stopped for a second and said, hey, can I get right back to you for a second? And would have turned and consulted the Lord Almighty. I think I know what would have happened. We'd still be in the garden. And so what's the solution to all this? Yeah, these things exist. Yes, some of us play, or all of us at some point in some time will play the blame game. All of us will give in to the boastful pride of life. All of us at some point will make a move because something seems delightful to the eyes or something seems delightful to the flesh. And so what is the solution to all of this? Now, for an in-depth look, you got to come back next week. But briefly, the ultimate design for your family, for your marriage, is this. Husband, wife for life, growing and moving together towards God. Isn't that interesting? That when both focus on God, as it was in the garden before the fall, between those two there is harmony and there is union. But as two people defocus, or one person doesn't focus on God, it goes back to this here. And the answer to that question is simply this. The foundation of family is faith in God. And if that's not currently in your family, then how can you hope to have peace and unity and harmony? Because you will only operate off of three things: lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, boastful pride of life. And you will blame and you'll put your spouse or your family in a box, and you'll always believe that it's never your fault. And then you'll come back and you'll wake up after you sleep after a long restless night, and you'll say, man, there's so much turmoil in my life. What am I doing wrong? I've read all the books. I've been to all the counseling. Question: have you considered what the Bible says about family and marriage? And so this morning, I just want to let everybody know as we close out. God's design for your family and for your life is not to be riddled with conflict. And that the problems that we see with those three principles are solved in knowing, growing, and showing God in our own lives and other people. So maybe this morning It's time to stop blaming. Maybe this morning, it's time to stop focusing everything that we do on ourselves to the detriment of our families. Do you need the prayers of this congregation? Do you need to make a life change? Do you need to make a family change? If so, don't wait. Do it this morning as we stand and as we sing.